The wind did not care about cause or consequence. It moved across the hills of Pennsylvania with steady indifference, cutting through canvas, bare wood, and exhausted bodies. Fires burned low, food ran short, and the ground itself seemed to resist rest. In that winter, survival was not assured, victory was distant, and the idea of a nation rested quietly on whether ordinary men could endure what lay before them. The winter of 1777–1778 found the American Revolutionary War at a dangerous midpoint. Nearly 3 years had passed since the first shots at Lexington and Concord, and the conflict had already tested the limits of colonial resistance. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, had fought, retreated, regrouped, and fought again. Victories were rare and costly. Defeats were frequent and discouraging. By December, Washington led roughly 12,000 soldiers into winter quarters at a place called Valley Forge, about 20 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia. It was a choice shaped by strategy, geography, and necessity, not comfort. Valley Forge was not selected for shelter or abundance. It offered defensible high ground and proximity to Philadelphia, allowing Washington to monitor British movements while preventing the enemy from foraging freely in the countryside. The land itself was open farmland and wooded hills, crossed by icy streams. There were no permanent structures sufficient for an army. What protection existed would have to be built by the soldiers themselves, using raw timber and limited tools, under worsening weather conditions. George Washington arrived with an army that was still forming its identity. The Continental Army was not a professional force in the European sense. It was composed of farmers, laborers, artisans, recent immigrants, and young men with little military experience. Many were enlisted for short terms, uncertain whether they would remain when spring came. Supplies were inconsistent, pay was delayed, and discipline varied widely. Washington's central desire was not immediate victory, but survival with cohesion intact. If the army dissolved, the war would likely end. The obstacle facing him was not only the British Army but scarcity. Congress struggled to provide adequate food, clothing, and equipment. Supply systems were fragmented, transportation unreliable, and corruption not uncommon. Soldiers arrived at Valley Forge lacking shoes, coats, or blankets. Footprints in the snow were often marked with blood. Disease spread quickly through crowded, damp huts. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed lives daily. Estimates suggest that nearly 2,000 men died during that winter, most not from combat, but from illness and exposure. Morale was fragile. Letters home spoke of hunger and neglect. Desertions increased, particularly among those whose enlistments were expiring. Some officers questioned Washington's leadership. Others feared the army would not last until spring. Beyond the camp, the political situation offered little comfort. Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies and the seat of Congress, was in British hands. The Continental Congress itself had fled. To many observers, the rebellion appeared close to collapse. Washington understood that endurance required more than orders. He moved constantly through the camp, inspecting huts, listening to complaints, and pressing Congress and state governments for aid. His correspondence from this period reveals frustration tempered by restraint. He criticized failures sharply but avoided public despair. Authority, he believed, had to be visible and steady, even when resources were thin. His presence, calm and persistent, became one of the Army's few constants. The soldiers built their winter quarters in rows, forming a rough but organized encampment. Each hut housed a dozen men, constructed from logs chinked with mud, topped with crude fireplaces. It was harsh shelter, but shelter nonetheless. Over time, routines developed. Drills continued when weather allowed. Guards were posted. Life settled into a rhythm shaped by cold, hunger, and waiting. The war had slowed, but it had not stopped. The deeper challenge at Valley Forge was not physical hardship alone, but the question of purpose. Many soldiers had joined to defend their homes or communities, not to endure months of suffering far from them. The cause of independence, still uncertain in outcome, demanded sacrifice without guarantee. What held the Army together was a mixture of loyalty to comrades, belief in leadership, and the gradual understanding that their endurance itself had meaning. The shift that changed the course of that winter arrived quietly, carried not by battle but by reform. In February 1778, a Prussian-born officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. He brought with him experience from European armies and a deep understanding of military discipline and training. Though he spoke little English, his impact was immediate. Washington recognized the need not only to keep the Army alive, but to make it effective. Von Steuben introduced standardized drills, teaching soldiers how to march, maneuver, and fight as coordinated units. He worked directly with the men, demonstrating movements himself, correcting errors patiently but firmly. For soldiers accustomed to inconsistent instruction, this was transformative. Training provided structure, purpose, and a sense of progress. The Army began to see itself not as a temporary gathering of individuals, but as a unified force. At the same time, administrative reforms improved supply distribution and camp sanitation. Latrines were repositioned, food handling improved, and disease rates began to decline. These changes did not eliminate suffering, but they reduced its worst effects. The camp became more orderly, more disciplined, and gradually more confident. Endurance turned into preparation. Beyond Valley Forge, the broader war was shifting as well. News arrived that France had formally recognized the United States and entered the war as an ally. This development, influenced in part by the American victory at Saratoga the previous fall, altered the strategic balance. It offered hope that the rebellion was no longer isolated, that survival might lead to success rather than endless struggle. By spring, the army that emerged from Valley Forge was not larger, but it was stronger in ways that mattered. When the British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778, Washington's forces followed, engaging them at the Battle of Monmouth. There, the Continental Army held its ground against British regulars in open battle, demonstrating discipline and resilience that had been absent earlier in the war. Valley Forge had not made victory certain, but it had made it possible. The result of that winter cannot be measured solely in military terms. Valley Forge became a proving ground for leadership, organization, and collective endurance. It exposed the weaknesses of the revolutionary effort, poor logistics, political fragmentation, and limited resources, while also revealing its capacity to adapt. The Army survived not because conditions improved quickly, but because it learned how to function despite them. Historically, Valley Forge has often been remembered as a symbol of sacrifice, yet its deeper significance lies in transformation. The Continental Army entered the winter as a fragile force held together by urgency. It emerged with a clearer structure, improved discipline, and renewed purpose. Washington's leadership was tested not in moments of triumph, but in sustained hardship, where patience and resolve mattered more than brilliance. For the soldiers who endured that winter, Valley Forge was not a legend, but a lived experience of cold mornings, empty stomachs, and uncertainty. Many never saw the war's end. Others carried the memory long after independence was secured. Their endurance did not guarantee success, but without it, success would have been impossible. The winter nearly broke America not because defeat was inevitable, but because survival demanded more than courage. It required organization, reform, and the willingness to endure without immediate reward. Valley Forge stands as a reminder that the American Revolution was not sustained by declarations alone, but by perseverance in moments when the future offered little reassurance. When spring came to Valley Forge, it did not bring relief from war, but it carried something quieter and more enduring: the knowledge that an army and the idea it served had survived its hardest season.